The coconut palms along the beach were still burning when Private First Class Robert Leckie crawled out of his foxhole on the morning of August 8, 1942. The air hung thick with the smell of cordite, rotting vegetation, and something else, something he would later describe as the particular sweetness of human decay that never quite left his nostrils for the rest of his life. He was 22 years old, a former sports writer from New Jersey who had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, and he had been on Guadalcanal for less than 36 hours. Around him, the men of the 1st Marine Division were discovering what the jungle had done to the night. Equipment was scattered everywhere. Helmets hung from branches. A corporal from his squad sat against a palm tree, methodically scraping dried blood from his carbar knife, his hands trembling so badly the blade kept slipping. No one had slept. No one would sleep properly for months. Leckie looked toward the airfield. They had seized the whole reason they were here and watched Marine engineers already filling bomb craters, working with a kind of desperate efficiency that seemed almost absurd given the chaos of the previous night. In Tokyo, Radio Tokyo was already broadcasting to the Pacific. The announcer's voice, smooth and mocking in English, referred to the American Marines as summer soldiers and Hollywood troops, men too soft from American luxury, too corrupted by movies and automobiles and ice cream to ever withstand the spiritual purity of Japanese fighting men. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. That phrase, Hollywood soldiers, would become a kind of dark joke among the Marines on Guadalcanal. They would hear it on captured Japanese documents. They would find it in diaries pulled from the bodies of dead enemy soldiers. And over the following 6 months, in some of the most brutal combat the Pacific War would ever produce, they would answer it in a way that would fundamentally alter Japanese strategic calculations for the remainder of the conflict. By the time the campaign ended in February 1943, approximately 7,000 Americans would be killed or wounded on and around the island. The Japanese would suffer over 31,000 dead, a ratio of more than 4-1, but these numbers, stark as they are, tell only part of the story. What happened on Guadalcanal was not merely a battle, it was a collision between two entirely different conceptions of warfare, two completely opposed understandings of what made men fight and what made armies win. And in that collision, assumptions that had governed Japanese military thinking for a generation would be systematically, irrevocably destroyed. To understand how the men of the 1st Marine Division came to be standing on that beach in August 1942, and why the Japanese High Command so catastrophically underestimated them, we must first understand what the United States Marine Corps actually was in the years before the war, and what the Japanese military had been taught to believe about American fighting capacity. The Marine Corps of the 1930s was a small, professional force that bore almost no resemblance to the massive organization it would become by 1945. In 1939, the entire Corps numbered fewer than 20,000 men, smaller than the New York City Police Department. These were long-service regulars, many of them veterans of the Banana Wars in Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, where they had learned a particular kind of fighting. Small unit actions in difficult terrain against elusive enemies, operations where individual initiative and junior leadership mattered more than massed firepower. They had also spent the 1930s developing something entirely new: amphibious assault doctrine. At Quantico and in fleet exercises, Marine officers had been working out the problems of how to land troops on hostile beaches against prepared defences, problems that most military theorists considered unsolvable after the disaster at Gallipoli in 1915. The result was a body of tactical knowledge, a set of specialized equipment, and a training regimen specifically designed for the kind of warfare that would characterize the Pacific Campaign. But none of this was visible to Japanese intelligence. What they saw instead was a nation that had dismantled most of its army after 1918, that had no recent experience of major combat, and whose popular culture seemed to celebrate softness, comfort, and material pleasure above martial virtue. Japanese military attachés in Washington during the 1930s reported back to Tokyo on American jazz clubs, American department stores, American obsession with automobiles and motion pictures. They, observed a society that seemed to prize individual comfort over collective sacrifice, and that appeared to lack the spiritual discipline that Japanese military philosophy placed at the center of combat effectiveness. This assessment was not entirely invented. It drew on real observations, filtered through a particular ideological lens. The Japanese military had developed, over several decades, a theory of warfare that placed enormous emphasis on what they called seishin spirit, willpower, the intangible qualities of morale and determination. This was not merely propaganda for domestic consumption. It was genuine doctrine, taught in staff colleges and applied in operational planning. Japanese officers sincerely believed that superior spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that willpower could substitute for firepower, that an army of men willing to die would inevitably defeat an army of men afraid to die. The corollary was that American material abundance was actually weakness. Men accustomed to comfort would not endure hardship. Men raised in a culture of individualism would not sacrifice for the group. Men whose lives were easy would not fight to the death. The phrase Hollywood soldiers captured something essential about Japanese expectations. The Americans would be like actors, performing the motions of combat, but lacking the authentic warrior spirit that gave Japanese soldiers their decisive edge. These assumptions had not yet been tested. Japan's string of victories in the 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma had all been won against opponents who were outnumbered, poorly supplied, and often poorly led. The speed of these conquests seemed to confirm the seishin theory. Japanese forces had taken supposedly impregnable positions, marched through supposedly impassable terrain, defeated enemies who supposedly had every material advantage. By mid-1942, the Japanese Empire had expanded across a vast arc of the Pacific and Southeast Asia, and the High Command in Tokyo was planning its next moves with a confidence that bordered on hubris. One of those next moves was the construction of an airfield on a malarial, jungle-covered island at the southern end of the Solomon Islands chain. The island was called Guadalcanal. The Japanese recognized the Solomons' strategic importance. An airfield there would allow them to threaten the supply lines between the United States and Australia, potentially forcing the Australians out of the war and establishing a defensive perimeter that would make any American counteroffensive prohibitively costly. Construction began in June 1942, with several thousand Japanese naval construction troops, not combat soldiers, working to carve a runway out of the jungle. American intelligence, aided by coast watchers, Australian and New Zealand civilians, and military personnel who had stayed behind in the Solomons to report on Japanese movements, learned of the airfield construction almost immediately. The implications were clear. If the Japanese completed that airfield, they would have land-based air power in a position to interdict Allied shipping across thousands of square miles of ocean. The decision to assault Guadalcanal was made with extraordinary speed and under conditions of severe constraint. The United States in mid-1942 had almost nothing to spare for a Pacific offensive. The country was still mobilizing, equipment was scarce, shipping was scarcer. The Germany First strategy meant that the Pacific theater would always be the secondary effort. But Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, insisted that the Navy and Marines take some kind of offensive action to keep the Japanese off balance and to maintain American morale after the long string of defeats. The 1st Marine Division, under Major General Alexander Vandergrift, was selected for the operation. They were the only division-sized Marine unit available. Many of them had enlisted after Pearl Harbor and had been rushed through abbreviated training programs. They were not the old breed veterans of the Banana Wars, but young men, former clerks and farmers and factory workers, who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Vandergrift had barely a month to plan the operation, which was almost absurdly inadequate for an undertaking of this complexity. Maps of Guadalcanal were scarce and inaccurate. Intelligence on Japanese strength was fragmentary. The rehearsal landing in Fiji was a fiasco, with landing craft grounding on reefs and supplies dumped in the wrong locations. The Marines called the operation shoestring, a grimly accurate description of the resources they had been allocated. On the morning of August 7, 1942, the invasion fleet arrived off Guadalcanal. The Marines went ashore against almost no opposition. The Japanese construction troops fled into the jungle and seized the airfield within 36 hours. It seemed, for a moment, almost easy. Then the Japanese reacted. What followed was one of the most sustained and vicious campaigns of the Pacific War. 6 months of naval battles, air raids, jungle combat, disease, starvation, and a grinding attritional struggle that would break the offensive power of the Japanese Navy and shatter the myth of Japanese invincibility. And at the center of it all were the men that Tokyo radio called soft, pampered, and weak. The first Japanese response came from the air. On the afternoon of August 7th, twin-engine bombers from Rabaul struck the invasion fleet, and for the next several months, the Marines on the island would live under constant air attack. The pattern became grimly familiar. The coast watchers would radio a warning, "Condition red," and men would scramble for foxholes while Japanese bombers and fighters roared overhead. The attacks came so regularly, almost always around midday, that the Marines began calling the daily raid Tojo time. But the bombers were only the beginning. The Japanese naval counterattack came on the night of August 8th, when a force of cruisers under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa slipped through the island chain and fell upon the Allied screening force off Savo Island. In a night action lasting barely half an hour, Mikawa's ships sank 4 Allied cruisers, 3 American and 1 Australian, and killed over 1,000 sailors. It was one of the worst defeats in the history of the United States Navy. The catastrophe at Savo Island had an immediate and devastating consequence for the Marines ashore. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the carrier task force providing air cover, had already been nervous about exposing his precious flat tops to Japanese air and submarine attack. The loss of the cruisers gave him the justification he needed. On August 9th, Fletcher withdrew his carriers, and with them went the transports that were still unloading supplies for the Marines. Vandergrift watched the fleet sail away over the horizon and understood exactly what it meant. His division was alone on Guadalcanal, with less than half their supplies ashore, surrounded by enemy-held territory, under daily air attack, with the Japanese Navy controlling the waters around them at night. They had food for about 37 days. Ammunition was limited. There was almost no barbed wire for defensive positions. The men began calling themselves orphans of the Pacific. What the Marines did next would begin to answer the question of what kind of soldiers they actually were. They finished the airfield. Working through air raids and tropical downpours, using captured Japanese equipment and whatever American machinery had made it ashore, they completed the runway, laid out revetments for aircraft, and established a functioning airbase. On August 20th, the first American planes, 19 Wildcat fighters, and 12 Dauntless dive bombers flew in from the escort carrier Long Island. The Marines called the airfield Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. It would become the most important piece of real estate in the South Pacific. Henderson Field was the key to everything. Whoever controlled the airfield controlled the air over Guadalcanal and the surrounding waters during daylight hours. That meant the Japanese could only reinforce and resupply their troops at night, using fast destroyer runs down the passage between the islands that the Marines began calling the Slot. This channel became famous as the route of the Tokyo Express, the nightly Japanese convoys that would disembark troops and supplies under cover of darkness, and then race back north before American planes could find them at dawn. The Japanese build-up was slow, constrained by this nocturnal logistics problem, but it was steady, and with each new contingent of troops came a new assault on the marine perimeter around Henderson Field. The first major ground attack came on August 21st, when a force of roughly 900 Japanese troops under Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki attempted to storm the marine positions along the Ilu River, east of the airfield. Ichiki was a veteran officer who had participated in the Marco Polo Bridge incident that started the war in China, and his men were elite naval infantry, the same troops who had overwhelmed the defences at Wake Island. They had been told the Marines were demoralised, starving, and on the verge of evacuation. Ichiki attacked at night, sending his men charging across the sandbar at the river's mouth directly into the teeth of marine machine guns and artillery. The result was annihilation. By morning, over 770 Japanese soldiers were dead, their bodies piled in the surf and along the riverbank. Ichiki himself, after ordering a final futile charge, burned his regimental colours and shot himself. The Marines had lost fewer than 40 killed. The Battle of the Tenaru, often misidentified as the Tenaru River, though it was actually the Ilu, was the first decisive ground engagement of the campaign, and it established a pattern that would repeat itself with almost mechanical regularity over the following months. The Japanese would bring in fresh troops. Their commanders would underestimate American strength and overestimate the effect of the Japanese fighting spirit. They would launch frontal attacks, often at night, against prepared marine positions, and they would be slaughtered. After the war, Japanese officers would acknowledge that Guadalcanal had been a turning point in their understanding of American combat capability, but in the fall of 1942, the High Command in Tokyo refused to accept what was happening. Each defeat was attributed to specific failures of planning or execution, never to fundamental flaws in doctrine. Each new attack was expected to succeed, where the previous one had failed. The Americans were still assumed to be soft, still expected to crack under pressure, still waiting to be beaten by superior Japanese willpower. The next major assault came in mid-September, when Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi led a force of over 6,000 men against the marine perimeter from the south. This time the Japanese attacked along a grassy ridge that would become one of the most famous pieces of terrain in Marine Corps history, known to the Americans as Edson's Ridge, or Bloody Ridge, after Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, whose raiders and paratroopers defended it. The fighting on the nights of September 12th and 13th was close, savage, and in places hand-to-hand. The Japanese came in waves, screaming and hurling grenades, breaking through the marine lines at multiple points. At the crisis of the battle, with his position nearly overrun, Edson was heard shouting to his men, "Raiders, parachutists, engineers, artillerymen, I don't give a damn who you are. You're all Marines. Come up on this ridge and fight." They held. By dawn on September 14th, over 600 Japanese bodies lay on and around the ridge. Kawaguchi, wounded and humiliated, led the remnants of his brigade back into the jungle, where disease and starvation would kill many of those who had survived the battle. The Marines had lost just over 100 killed. Once again, the ratio was roughly 6-1. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters refused to interpret these results accurately. They decided that the problem was simply one of scale, not enough troops had been committed. They began planning for a much larger offensive, to be launched in late October, which would finally destroy the Marine garrison and recapture Henderson Field. For this operation, they would commit the entire 17th Army, under Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, over 20,000 men, supported by massive naval forces. While the Japanese planned their offensive, the Marines on Guadalcanal were living an existence that reduced war to its most elemental terms. The conditions were almost indescribable. The heat was relentless, the humidity suffocating. Rain fell in sheets that turned foxholes into ponds and trails into rivers of mud. The jungle was so dense that visibility dropped to a few feet, and patrols sometimes passed within yards of Japanese positions without seeing them. The island's insect life was prodigious and merciless. Mosquitoes, flies, centipedes, land crabs, and ants that seemed to materialize from nowhere to swarm over any source of food. The mosquitoes carried malaria. By October, almost every man in the division was infected. The disease produced fevers that spiked to 104 degrees, chills that made men's teeth chatter uncontrollably, and a bone-deep exhaustion that made even walking an ordeal. Atabrine, the synthetic anti-malarial, was in short supply and caused its own unpleasant side effects. Men fought while shaking with fever, went on patrol while barely able to stand, stood watch while delirious. The division surgeon estimated that at the peak of the epidemic, the effective combat strength of the 1st Marine Division was reduced by nearly half. Food was scarce. For weeks, the Marines subsisted on 2 meals a day, then one. The rations were often Japanese rice captured from enemy supplies, or a thin gruel that the men called cat's eyes. Weight loss of 20 or 30 pounds was common. Some men lost more. They joked grimly about the Guadalcanal diet. And through it all, there were the nightly bombardments from Japanese naval vessels that raced down the slot, shelled Henderson Field and the marine perimeter, and vanished before dawn. The worst came on the night of October 13th, when the battleships Congo and Haruna, each mounting 14-inch guns, stood offshore and pounded the airfield for over an hour. The Marines called it the bombardment. Nearly 1,000 shells fell on Henderson Field, destroying most of the aircraft, igniting fuel dumps, and killing over 40 men. The earth shook so violently that men in their foxholes were bounced into the air. Private Robert Leckie, the sports writer from New Jersey, described the experience as a nightmare of screaming steel and exploding earth that left men crying and praying and swearing all at once. By mid-October, the situation appeared desperate. The airfield was a wasteland of craters. Only a handful of aircraft remained operational, and the Japanese were clearly massing for a major offensive. Vandergrift's superiors wondered if evacuation would be necessary. Some staff officers at Pacific Fleet headquarters began planning for it, but the Marines held. They held because the young pilots of the Cactus Air Force, the grab bag collection of Marine, Navy, and Army aviators flying out of Henderson Field, refused to be suppressed. After each bombardment, they flew missions on whatever aircraft could be patched together, often going up with bullet holes in their fuselages and hydraulic fluid leaking over their feet. They held because Navy supply ships, taking terrible losses from Japanese submarines and air attack, kept bringing in just enough ammunition, fuel, and food to sustain operations. They held because individual Marines, sergeants and corporals and privates kept doing their jobs despite malaria and dysentery and exhaustion and fear. And they held because when the Japanese finally launched their grand October offensive, the Marines stopped them cold. The attack came on the night of October 24th. Hyakutake had planned a coordinated assault from multiple directions. The main effort from the south aimed once again at the ridge positions, with secondary attacks from the east and the west. It was supposed to be the decisive blow that would finally prove the superiority of Japanese spirit over American materialism. Instead, it became a catastrophe. The assault from the south, led by Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama, was delayed because his troops became lost in the jungle and arrived at their jump-off positions piecemeal and exhausted. When they attacked on the night of the 24th and again on the 25th, they ran into the same prepared defences that had destroyed their predecessors. Marines in foxholes, with interlocking fields of fire, supported by artillery and mortars that had pre-registered every avenue of approach. The fighting was horrific. At one point, a Japanese column broke through the lines of the 7th Marines and penetrated nearly to Henderson Field itself before being stopped. But by dawn on the 26th, it was over. The ridge was carpeted with Japanese dead, over 2,500 of them. The secondary attacks failed even more completely. To the east, Ichiki's successor, his unit, had been rebuilt and recommitted, tried to storm Marine positions along the Matanikau River, and was repulsed with heavy losses. To the west, a tank attack was annihilated when Marine anti-tank guns destroyed all 9 of the light tanks committed. The total Japanese casualties for the October offensive exceeded 3,500 killed. American losses were under 300. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. After October, the character of the Guadalcanal campaign changed. The Japanese would continue to send troops to the island, but they no longer had any realistic hope of recapturing Henderson Field. The initiative had passed to the Americans. In November, despite 2 more vicious naval battles in the waters around Guadalcanal Iron Bottom Sound, as it came to be known, after all the ships sunk there, the American Navy established effective control of the sea. Reinforcements and supplies poured in. Fresh Army troops arrived to relieve the exhausted Marines. In December and January, it was the Americans who went on the offensive, driving the Japanese back toward the western end of the island. The Japanese High Command, recognizing at last that the island could not be held, ordered evacuation. In early February 1943, Japanese destroyers slipped into Guadalcanal at night and took off over 10,000 survivors, gaunt, sick, many of them barely able to walk. On February 9th, American forces reached the western coast and found the Japanese gone. The campaign was over. The human cost told the story. The United States had suffered approximately 7,000 casualties, killed and wounded, across all services: ground, air, and naval. The Japanese had lost over 31,000, the vast majority of them dead. The disparity in ground combat was even more extreme. Marine and Army ground forces lost approximately 1,600 killed, while Japanese Army deaths exceeded 20,000. The ratio, roughly 12 to 1, was unprecedented. The numbers stunned the Japanese High Command. They had expected a hard fight, but they had assumed that Japanese spiritual superiority would eventually tell, that the Americans would reach a breaking point, that the softness of their culture would manifest in battlefield collapse. None of that had happened. The Marines had absorbed everything the Japanese threw at them: air raids, naval bombardments, massed infantry assaults, disease, starvation, and they had not only held, but counterattacked and won. In the recriminations that followed, some Japanese officers began to acknowledge what had actually happened. Colonel Tsuji Masanobu, one of the staff officers who had planned the October offensive, wrote after the war that Guadalcanal had changed forever his understanding of American fighting qualities. The phrase, "Hollywood soldiers," disappeared from Japanese propaganda. It had become not merely inaccurate but bitter evidence of a fatal miscalculation. What the Japanese had encountered on Guadalcanal was something their ideology had not prepared them for. An enemy that combined American material resources with a fighting spirit as fierce as their own. The Marines had endured conditions as brutal as any their opponents faced. They had fought at close quarters, in the dark, with bayonets and rifle butts when their ammunition ran out. They had refused to retreat from positions under massive attack. They had, in some cases, fought to the death. The assumption that material abundance made men soft, that comfort bred weakness, that democracy produced soldiers incapable of sacrifice, all of it, had been proven disastrously wrong. What the Japanese had not understood, could not understand, given their ideological framework, was that American fighting effectiveness had different sources than Japanese. The Marines on Guadalcanal were not motivated by emperor worship or Bushido or a belief in racial destiny. They were motivated by unit cohesion, by loyalty to each other, by the Marine Corps' intense internal culture of professionalism and pride. They were motivated by a determination, fed by Pearl Harbor and the long months of defeat, to prove that they could beat the Japanese at their own game. And they were motivated, in a way their opponents consistently underestimated, by a pragmatic, problem-solving approach to combat that drew on American cultural strengths. When something didn't work, they tried something else. When they were outgunned, they improvised. When their equipment failed, they fixed it or captured Japanese equipment and used that instead. The same cultural traits that produced Hollywood and Detroit ingenuity, adaptability, a refusal to accept that any problem was unsolvable, turned out to be formidable military assets. There was also something else, something harder to quantify but no less important: the Marines' sense of identity. The Corps had spent years cultivating an elite, self-image, a belief that Marines were different from regular soldiers, harder, more professional, held to a higher standard. This institutional culture, transmitted through boot camp and reinforced by the veterans of the Banana Wars who served as sergeants and staff NCOs, gave the young Marines on Guadalcanal a psychological framework for enduring hardship. They suffered, but they expected to suffer. They were supposed to be able to take it. Complaining meant you weren't a real Marine. It was not a gentle philosophy. It costs lives, sometimes unnecessarily. It could shade into a machismo that ignored real problems. But on Guadalcanal, in the particular circumstances of that campaign, it worked. The Hollywood soldiers turned out to be as hard as anyone the Japanese had ever faced. For Japan, the consequences of Guadalcanal extended far beyond the island itself. The campaign had consumed irreplaceable resources, aircraft, ships, and above all, trained pilots and experienced ground troops. Japanese naval aviation lost over 200 aircraft and many of their best aircrews. The combined fleet lost 2 battleships, 1 carrier, 4 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The ground forces lost the equivalent of an entire elite division veterans who could not be replaced. More importantly, Guadalcanal forced a fundamental revision of Japanese strategy. The hope of expanding the defensive perimeter, of creating a barrier so formidable that America would negotiate a settlement rather than breach it, was abandoned. After Guadalcanal, Japan was on the defensive. The initiative had passed, permanently, to the Allies. What happened to the men who fought there? Robert Leckie, the sports writer from New Jersey, was wounded on Guadalcanal and later at Peleliu. He survived the war and wrote one of the finest memoirs to come out of the Pacific conflict, Helmet for My Pillow, published in 1957. He never forgot what he had seen on that first morning, with the palms still burning and the smell of death hanging in the air. Merritt Edson, who held Bloody Ridge, was awarded the Medal of Honor and rose to Brigadier General. After the war, he became a vocal advocate for the Marine Corps' institutional independence and later for gun rights. He struggled with depression and took his own life in 1955. Alexander Vandergrift, who commanded the division through the worst of the campaign, also received the Medal of Honor and became Commandant of the Marine Corps. He spent his later years insisting that the real heroes of Guadalcanal were the young Marines in the foxholes, not the generals who directed them. And in Japan, the men who survived Guadalcanal, the 10,000 evacuated in February, plus those wounded earlier, carried a particular burden. They had lost, they had retreated. Many of them never spoke of the campaign, because to do so was to acknowledge a failure that the Japanese military code could not accommodate. Some of them went on to die in later battles, on other islands, in the same futile charges against the same interlocking fields of fire. The lessons of Guadalcanal were learned by the Americans. They were not learned by the Japanese. Looking back, what made the difference? Not material superiority, at least not at first. For most of the campaign, the Japanese had as many troops on the island as the Americans. They had naval superiority at night and contested air superiority by day. The supply situation was difficult for both sides. Not superior tactics. The Americans made mistakes, plenty of them. Patrols were ambushed, attacks were repulsed, positions were overrun. The individual Japanese soldier, as the Marines would readily admit, was a formidable opponent, well-trained, physically tough, utterly determined. The difference was that the Americans adapted faster. They learned from their mistakes and did not repeat them. Their junior officers were encouraged to think independently and respond to changing conditions. Their whole system, logistics, intelligence, medical support, firepower coordination, was designed to support the men at the front, to give them the tools they needed to do their jobs. War, in the American approach, was a problem to be solved with organization, innovation, and relentless pressure. The Japanese approach, rooted in the cult of seishin, was designed to overcome material disadvantage through willpower. But willpower, however ferocious, cannot overcome machine guns, artillery, and aircraft if you simply walk into their fire over and over again. Courage is not a substitute for fire support. Spirit does not stop bullets. On Guadalcanal, these two philosophies met, and the outcome was decisive. There is a moment in Robert Leckie's memoir when he describes the aftermath of the Battle of the Tenaru. He walked among the Japanese dead on the sandbar, looking at the bodies piled in the surf. Some of them were still clutching their rifles. Some had gotten close enough to the Marine positions to die on the barbed wire. They had come on, wave after wave, into the teeth of concentrated fire, and they had not stopped coming until they were almost all dead. Leckie, exhausted and sick, looked at them and felt something that surprised him. Not triumph, not hatred, but a kind of horrified respect. These men had been willing to die. They had been told that would be enough. They had been wrong. The phrase Hollywood soldiers assumed that American material comfort made Americans weak. It was exactly backward. American material comfort was the product of a system, industrial, organizational, cultural, that was staggeringly good at solving problems and producing results. That system, turned to war, was not soft. It was lethal. The Marines on Guadalcanal were the first to prove it. They would not be the last. When Leckie left the island in December 1942, he was a different man than the boy who had waded ashore in August. So were all of them. They carried the weight of what they had seen and done for the rest of their lives. Many of them never talked about it. Some of them never stopped talking about it. All of them knew something that could only be learned in a place like Guadalcanal. They knew what they were made of, and the men who had called them soft, pampered, and weak, who had expected them to break the men who had believed that American democracy bred soldiers who would not fight those men lay buried in the jungle, in graves that were already disappearing under the relentless growth of the tropical forest. The island was swallowing them up. By the end of the war, over 30,000 Japanese soldiers would be buried on Guadalcanal. The island became a word in the Japanese language, a synonym for catastrophe, for the place where the myth of Japanese invincibility went to die. The Hollywood soldiers had written their answer. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.